Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am at AK Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 160. And this episode, we are doing a console retrospective as voted for by our patrons on Patreon. Thank you so much for making this your console of choice, as it was the console of choice for millions and millions of people, because we're talking about the PlayStation 2 this episode. And to join us in that retrospective and celebration of Sony's tour de force, honestly, from Left Behind Gaming Club, we have Flora Merigold. Ms. Merigold, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Flora has done at least one side quest for us, but I've wanted to have Flora on the main show for a while, and when we were trying to find someone to... It's funny, I thought the PS2 would be like, all right, who wants to do a PS2 episode? And like the floodgates would open. And it just, for whatever reason, I guess I try not to ask on Twitter for a lot of reasons, but like I try to ask in podcasting circles because it's been fun to bring other podcasters from other gaming shows to talk about these consoles. And when I posted about this, you were like, oh yeah, that would be fun. So we're really excited to have you. As we want to do with these retrospectives, we talk a little bit about our history with the console, and then we'll get broadly into why this console was great. Besides the fact that it was a DVD player, like let's get that out of the way real early. The high sales of this console in the early days is because it was the cheapest DVD player on the market, and I think that is fascinating in a way that other consoles like don't really touch. The regular Xbox needed a drive, but the Xbox 360 played DVDs as well, but that came later. And so like it's just fascinating to me that like the easiest way to beg your parents to get this console was like, well, it plays DVDs and it's much cheaper than a DVD player. And I just find that fascinating.
And I imagine there's more than a few households that the kids didn't even ask for a PlayStation 2, but the parents wanted a DVD player and this was the way to do it. And it all just went from there. It really is a credit to Sony's history as an electronics manufacturer and creator of all those. The PS1 was also a CD player, but we had those. This was kind of moving that forward. And they tried it again with the PS3 and the Blu-ray player, and it worked.
Ish.
It didn't help that it was the most expensive Blu-ray player on the market with that. So this was that nice happy medium.
Yeah, for sure. So this came out in the year 2000. In the year 2000. In most places.
Yes. It was released March 4th, 2000 in Japan and October 26th in the U.S.
Yeah, very dated Conan O'Brien reference for those who remember that shtick. And then the Slimline came out in about 4 years later. I've owned both versions. I've owned the Giant Monster, which is actually not giant compared to the current gen of PlayStation.
We had it so good.
And then I also bought a Slim later, which is what I currently own because that brick didn't last forever. To start with our background, Flora, I'd love for you to go first and tell us if you remember about when you got the PS2 and then maybe what the first game you bought with it was.
It's really strange. I must have been 7 or 8 years old when this happened for me.
I'm so old.
No, don't be hard on yourself. I was born in 1993, and so dust off the cobwebs real quick. I got this for Christmas without asking for it.
Oh.
And which, like, good job, Mom.
Yeah.
And for context, I was raised by a single mom, so this was like an especially big deal. Like, she did not have expendable income. And it was a bundle PS2 with Gran Turismo 3 A Spec. And that makes me think this must have been 2001. Mm-hmm. I don't think this was 2000 only because the first games that I got for this console were like Jak and Daxter, The Precursor Legacy, SSX Tricky, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. And I think all of those came out after the calendar date of the original release window. And so for me, my first memories were like complete shock, surprise. I had a demo disc and a Gran Turismo game. I ran upstairs and like tried haphazardly to like figure out how to plug it in. And I think I got the color cords wrong in the back of the TV and like had to like keep being frustrated for a few extra minutes than I needed to. But then it was just magic. I think back on some of my earlier gaming memories than that, and it's really surprising that my mom realized that that would be something that would be good for me, like that I would love.
I love that. That's so awesome. Knowing you as the kind of games that you like as we've become friends over the years, like Gran Turismo would be so far low on the list.
Right.
And yet,
right.
And yet it's the first game you got, which I think is very funny.
I guess racing games are always like the benchmark game of any console generation. And so like when I booted this up, like it was the thing that came in the box. I guess, one, my dad forced me to play sports like my entire childhood. So I think my mom thought that I liked sports. Took a couple more years for us to like work through that one. But the actual graphical fidelity of the game and the performance of the game, it felt like the future,
Right.
which I'm sure, I haven't done this, but I'm sure if I looked up playthrough footage of Gran Turismo 3, I would cringe a little bit at how convinced I was by it.
Sure.
Like, I look at like a Forza Horizon now and I still think that, but like, I know it looks realistic now.
Right.
Give me another 20 years and I'm sure I'll cringe at this current opinion too.
Yeah, totally. But we've talked about before in other retrospectives that at the time of launch of those consoles, it's very easy to think this is the pinnacle of gaming, because at the time it was. For me, so I had a PS1, I got it late. It's a story most of our listeners are familiar with, because Geoff and I mostly, with a few exceptions, didn't get consoles at launch. And the PS2 was no exception. I had gotten the PS1 very late in its cycle. I had played the Super Nintendo for a long time and then eventually begged my parents for a PlayStation much later on, mostly to play wrestling games, which is funny now since I don't play a lot of wrestling games anymore. But with the PS2, I knew I wanted it. I knew it was coming out, and I absolutely made that pitch because I wanted to start buying DVDs. And I was like, it's a pretty cheap DVD player. And like, if you wanted to get me a birthday gift, instead of buying me a DVD player and a video game console, this would be one price for both and much cheaper. I don't know if my dad bought that story or just was like, let's get you this thing that you want, that I contributed some of my own gift cards and dollars towards. But when I picked it up, the two games I got, it's funny to me, like I'm the opposite, Flora. Like I think they defined my video game future, because one of the games I got, I showed a physical prop later, one of the few PS2 games I still own my original copy of, is the Tetsunomura masterpiece, loosely using that term, the Squaresoft game, The Bouncer, which was, for those who don't know, a beat 'em up. The lead character is giving Sora long before Sora ever existed. And it was this weird story of like friendship and this gang and fighting. I honestly couldn't even tell you what the narrative is now. It's been so long since I played it. And then the other game that I got with my PS2 for the character action sickos in the crowd was Devil May Cry, a game that like I remember seeing in the ad that the lead character got stabbed by a sword, pinned down, and then rose through it. And I was like, there's so much blood. This is so cool. Which I was, at the time, a teenage kid and was like, this is all I want.
Your emo baby heart just soared.
Pretty much. I fell in love with Dante within minutes. And that game, of course, anyone who knows me knows I love character action games. I've gone on to play all of the Devil May Cry series. Hi-Fi Rush is one of my favorite games of this year. And so, like, it's so funny looking back and being like, because for other consoles, I don't think there's that clear path to me as a modern game player, but that console specifically, which I think I own the most games for at the time of any other console I bought around that time, really kind of predicted the future of the kinds of games I would play, both a ton of Squaresoft, Square Enix games, and then character action stuff. And it's just funny how that kind of worked out.
Yeah, it makes sense. I would say for me, it was sort of two waves, because I very much became aware of the PS2 early on. The PlayStation 2 was also formally announced, despite years of rumors. It was formally announced on March 2nd, 1999, which was about 6 months before the Dreamcast came out. So for some people, that effectively killed the Dreamcast. There are a lot of other things that killed the Dreamcast, but I distinctly remember a good friend of mine who I was thinking about this and realized both the PS1 and the PS2, he introduced me to them. He had them basically at launch. I remember playing Battle Arena Toshinden with him on the PS1, thinking this is the pinnacle of fighting games. And honestly, the first game I remember playing with him on the PS2 was also The Bouncer. And
Nice.
Thinking about it, that makes a lot of sense, because that was a Dream Factory game working with Squaresoft. And
Right.
Dream Factory was also responsible for Air Guys, God Bless the Ring, and the Tobal games. And Tobal #1 was also a very big hit in that house. So that makes a lot of sense. And Devil May Cry was also another one, but I don't remember off and on what we played a lot of there. The PS2 entering into my life, my home, my everything wasn't until 2004 when I was in college. It was my freshman year, and one of the people in my dorm really needed money and sold me his fat PlayStation 2 for $40.
Wow.
Whoa.
Yep. I didn't even go like, all I got is $40. He went, give me $40. It's yours, man. Like, I don't need it. So yeah, I had a PS2 suddenly. And so for the most part, I just used it to play my old PS1 games. I remember hanging out with people and grinding in Symphony of the Night for the most part for a while there. And I think the first two games that I got were We Heart Katamari, because I had played the first
That
Katamari
checks out.
Damacy so much at a different friend's house. I had a full-on Katamari Damacy obsession phase before I ever had a PlayStation 2. and I also picked up Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater.
Also very telling.
Yeah, so Matt, much like you, but I also had the time to be reading Game Informer magazines, to be on forums, everything else. I knew what I liked and I knew what I wanted in my PlayStation 2 experience. So I feel like that's cheating to go, and it determined where the rest of my gaming life went. I had years to decide. And even though 2004 was effectively kind of the sunsetting of PlayStation 2 as the forefront, the PlayStation 3 came out not long after. I held on to that PS2 for a long time, and I did eventually get a Slim, and now the PlayStation 2 that I've got hooked up to my TV is a Slim. It's an incredible machine.
Yeah. Not every PlayStation feels like it has the durability quality of a Nintendo console. Like Nintendo consoles, you can throw out the window and will probably survive. But like the PS2 feels like one of those consoles, because I know that the original PS2 had laser reader issues, like if it got jostled or whatever. And then I know that the PlayStation 1 also had some of that stuff. But the PS2 Slim, like I know of my friends who still play PS2 games, like that's the one they have, and they've had it since they bought it, which doesn't seem to happen with a ton of other consoles.
I, for years, was impressed at the durability of the PS2. I never owned a Nintendo console. The PS2 was my first console, other than like a Game Boy or something, which I don't think counts. It's a handheld. And so I would bring it back and forth to my dad's house between weekends. I would bring it to my friend's house for sleepovers and like LAN parties. And that thing lasted me until I decided I didn't need it anymore. And it was only because the PS3, the model that I got, was backwards compatible that I thought to myself, oh, I don't need this hardware any longer. And I bet if I had decided to keep it, it would still work.
Yeah.
Yeah, those things are workhorses. The lasers will probably start wearing out in the next 5 years or so, depending upon how often people use them. But I think as far as a compact system goes, it's also that kind of like long and flat. It goes well amongst books or in a backpack or something, which leaves more room for the controllers. So you can bring more of those and bring more accessories. And it's actually very funny to be talking about this as sort of in comparison to Nintendo, because when we think of Nintendo, we tend to think of accessories, peripherals, everything else. But I think because the PlayStation 2 is backwards compatible with the PS1, and it had the same controller, a lot of things, the attachment point and everything else, it allowed for a lot of third-party development, allowed for a lot of those. And so before we even get into dance pads and guitars, there was already plenty of other accessories and things. So I also appreciate the space saved by the console allowed for more bullshit.
Yes.
And I mean that affectionately.
Of course, yeah. So, like, talking about the controller for a minute, the Xbox came out around the same time, and I think this is the console generation that defined modern gaming, I would say, control-wise, right? Every controller since the PS2 dual analog stick controller has been chasing that. Now, the dual analog did come out for the PS1 towards the end of its life cycle, but it wasn't in box until the PS2. And the Xbox 360, especially the Xbox One, or
the original Xbox.
Yeah, the naming conventions are killing me. The original Xbox had the larger controller that was kind of chunky and much bigger, like often denounced as like too big, too hard to use, which I don't know that I would agree with. The Duke, yeah.
The Duke.
But these two controllers, but specifically the PS2, because it was obviously the higher selling console, like put dual analog modern first person control in the hands of everybody who plays video games in a way that's become kind of ubiquitous now with video game playing.
I strongly prefer the PlayStation layout to controllers to this day, and I know that's like a controversially held opinion.
Not with me.
Some people are like, some people love their Xbox like asymmetrical joysticks. Some people love their GameCube controller with like the 43 different buttons going on, and the giant green button, which we can all appreciate.
Yes.
And yet, I still think that this is the most iconic controller design of all time. Even something that's like no longer part of the controller scheme anymore. As these things have evolved, there used to be the analog like toggle button.
Yeah.
It was like a little like, I don't know what to call it, like a plastic of some kind, but like it was like meshy, and you would press it in soft, and like that thing would either turn on and off this little red button. And like Those things, I think, are still iconic, even though they aren't extant anymore. We've moved on to haptic feedback and like adaptive triggers and like touchscreen swipey things when we play Spider-Man 2 and whatnot. But I still think that like this is the precedent setter of controllers.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's kind of nice that they were able to launch with that. And it's funny that you mentioned, yeah, we have had so many advancements since. I held on to my PS2 for a while. The next PlayStation console I got was the PlayStation TV, the Vita thing. And then I kind of like got a PS4, went back to the PS3, everything else, and I'm now filling in the gaps for myself. So for me, all of those advancements, I just completely leapfrogged them, and the DualShock 2 was sort of the, like, yes, we've reached perfection. And I still ran into the fact that it had other interesting, subtle advancements to them. It launched with the system. It was assumed to be packed in with the system. You could have that level of 3D control as part of the design. You could assume you had 2 sticks. We'd had enough time futzing around in the dark with the PS1 to figure out how to control a 3D space. The 2 sticks, with small exceptions, is a great way to go. I love it. And so that meant you could do that. Whereas you'd put in old PS1 games, and that got a little weird. And it also had contact-sensitive buttons. It actually was pressure-sensitive. And
Right.
I would mostly run into this because I still had my PlayStation 1 controllers. I got a PS2 controller in that deal, and I would plug in my old ones, and I just liked them a little better sometimes. And then I played Mad Maestro for the first time because I got that even back then for like $4 because no one wanted it. And it was pressure sensitive in terms of how it played or what it did. Or Metal Gear Solid 3, how hard you pressed the buttons determined whether or not you interrogated people in a chokehold or just snapped their neck. And I didn't know why I kept killing these guys. And then actually Mad Maestro was the thing that made me realize it's just like, oh, you're just getting on and off, aren't you?
So how did those pressure sensitivity buttons work? Because I've actually not looked into that. I'm curious. I don't have a distinctive gaming memory in my own like lexicon of a failure point like that around those pressure buttons.
I haven't looked into the tech myself. I don't think it was necessarily like an accelerometer or anything like that, but I think it was a matter of gradients of how either fast or how gently you push the buttons. So it could kind of, you could have it a little bit versus a lot.
Yeah, like you don't feel like a click when you press a PS2 button or something.
Right.
At some point I learned about this probably 3-4 years ago, but like the experience of playing it wasn't as distinctive and as apparent to me as it sounds like it was for you, Geoff.
And again, I only knew about it because I was having points of failure in games that needed it, and I was playing with a controller that didn't have that sensitivity. And
Yeah.
having played with the PS2 controller ever since, one way or the other, you're right though, Flora. Like there's no click. There's no like, there's something interesting or different going on here. It's just seamless, which in some cases is beautiful design and lovely. And in this instance, what? Why am I getting this wrong? Because of an assumed feature of something that came with the system.
It also makes me think about like all the peripheral like Mad Catz controllers or even the DDR pads like that I'm sure we're going to get to. Are those incorporating the pressure sensitivity, or is that strictly like a first party thing? And how required is that? The question seems to be answered by you as like, oh, with certain games it is required.
Yes.
And so I think back to playing with those like third party like knockoff controllers that were, I don't know, $20 cheaper.
Always.
And I wonder if there was something that was like frustrating that I did experience that only now I'm recognizing is explicable by, oh, we just didn't put the pressure sensitivity in the buttons.
It's possible. Because, it's such a weird hidden little thing. And it brings to mind for me as far as, like how required is it in a game design? It's not required. It makes me think of the DualSense 5 controller and the definable pressure points of the back triggers, where that is meant to be felt and meant to be part of that experience versus the subtlety of how you play, which now that we're talking about it, I also realize the pressure sensitive button is kind of how kids playing on old arcade games or old Nintendo games, you feel like if you press the button harder, it will go better or you'll jump farther or something.
Right.
Something to that extent. And it's coming true here. And they just didn't do a good job of telling us, I guess.
Just press the B button and the Pokeball will catch the Pokemon.
Right.
Everybody knows that.
Everybody.
I hold down and press A with each wiggle of the Pokeball, and it does nothing.
Yeah, it's interesting to look back on this controller considering, I mean, like Xbox has mostly standardized their controllers since the 360, especially after the Xbox One. I feel like they're just the same controllers. They work with multiple platforms. Sony's controllers, though similar, are different with every generation. I'd say the jump from PS2 to PS3 was the most similar. Other than that, controller felt like it was hollow because of just the way it was designed. It had no weight to it like the other ones did. But even the PS5 controller, which I happen to like, and the PS4 controller, which also is less of a leap, right? Those two are very similar as well. They all are still just building on this original design from the two, right? Like even the innovations are more in how the control works than the shape or change of the control. There is some minor shape changes, but for the most part, it stayed the same. I'm not sure that I have a preference one way or the other. I don't know. My brain is this partitioned way of like, if I'm playing a PC or Xbox game, I'm using an Xbox controller. If I'm playing a PlayStation game, I'm using the PlayStation controller. If I'm playing a Switch game, well, I'm holding the Switch in my hand, so it's irrelevant. And in that fact, like I have tried to use my PS5 controller on my computer because you can, especially if you're like streaming to the computer using the PlayStation app. And it felt weird. Like it just, my brain couldn't parse it. And I think there's something to be said about how ingrained, especially this gen of controller is into the ripples of what controllers we're using now. And I think a lot of that is also the way games kind of evolved from the PS1 to the PS2, because 3D became so much more ingrained in the PS2's library. And those two analog sticks were almost required, I'd say, for 99% of the games.
I think that camera control is one of the biggest things that I would point to here as like the evolution in game design, but also like the function of how the controller contributes to that evolution in game design.
Yeah.
There are some games, like your 3D platformers in particular, that I think a lot of people are nostalgic for these days. Like, why aren't they really coming out with the frequency that they used to? Why aren't there these sort of like title holding, like Jack and Daxter characters, your Ratchet and Clank, even to some extent like a Mario or a Sonic or whatever? Those games, I think, sort of were popular because of the fact that it was still new and they were still exploring like what those elements of the controller editions could do for game design. And I just think that that's like something that if you look back and like point to what is considered a classic PS1 game, very few times are they going to have a dynamic camera. They're almost always going to be locked in place, like your Final Fantasy VIIs, for example. I think that that's the thing that I at least take away and appreciate from what y'all are discussing.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is sort of the 16-bit to the PS1's 8-bit of 3D design, where something I alluded to before and something that whenever I go back to old PS1 games blows my mind is older games that would have as a camera control, you use the shoulder buttons to just slowly rotate the camera.
Yeah.
You know, the shoulder buttons are for camera control, right? That's totally what we're going to use
We've
them
all
for.
played Kingsfield 4 for the
We've solved it. Let's go to lunch, everybody, kind of thing. So that's always a bitch of a thing to go back to. And yeah, you're right. A lot of times you would have either pre-rendered backgrounds or specific camera angles. Resident Evil is definitely a game that comes to mind as far as that goes, where I think some of it was design and some of it was limitations of medium, of console, of how much you could store on the disc. And DVD storage and however many bits and everything else allows for even the pedestrian designs to have that full area.
I actually, not to harp on the PS2 as some sort of like problem, but I am a fan with creative works of constraints on things.
Right.
And I think that maybe some of the nostalgia we feel for something like a tank control Resident Evil is just like, oh, this only could have happened because we cut off one of your designing arms. And I wonder like what the PS5 era would look like, for example, if there was suddenly that constraint put upon the developers.
You see that a lot in indie design these days, and not just in the nostalgia style of PS1 polygons where everyone's having a great time in Blender. And as a fervent follower of the development cycle of Bloodborne Kart, I'm so for it. But I am also a big fan of constraint breeding creativity. And PS2 is sort of a crossover point. The sixth generation of consoles across the board, but the PS2 as what kind of became what I like to call the eventually default for that generation, where even games that were intended to be exclusive to other consoles eventually came to PS2 because of the install base. I'm looking at Beautiful Joe and Resident Evil 4 and just the Capcom 5 there and everything else, but also carries with it the old anything goes of the PS1. You got Mr. Mosquito and Mad Maestro on the PS2 because you got things like Incredible Crisis and Irritating Stick on the PS1. You can look at any console in any generation and be like, oh, it's got a little bit of the old and a little bit of the new. But I loved the wild frontier of PlayStation 1, and the PS2 carried that with it, along with the youth culture teen edge of the late 90s, early aughts, the MTV TRL optimism tech that, came out in 2000, so it carried with it past 9/11, which was really seen as sort of the death knell for that, into the next generations, but, there we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a good pivot point to start talking about the games a little bit. First, I have to admit some gaming sins right off the bat. Didn't play any of the God of Wars because I liked Devil May Cry better and was like one of those idiots who said you can't play one without the other. Stupid. I also never played any of the character action platformers on this console, though loving them on the N64. My first experience with Ratchet and Clank was the remake on the PS4.
Real good remake, though.
Yes, it was a great remake, but I never played Jak and Daxter. I never played Ratchet and Clank.
Didn't even play Sly Cooper?
I played the first Sly Cooper for the first time on my Steam Deck this year.
Glad you found it, honestly. That's the joy.
Right, but it's really interesting to me is my library for the PS2 was bizarre anime games, all of these franchise games. And I love Devil May Cry, and there were other franchise games that I played, but for some reason, the biggest Sony mascot games of that generation, I just never touched. I have since played the modern God of War, and I started Ragnarok, though I never finished it, and I liked the new God of War. And maybe someday I'll go back to the old ones. So I've heard the new one's better than all of those. But a lot of those standard, you must have played this game. I play the Final Fantasies, RPGs, all of that stuff, but I like the weird little guys. And I think that this console, we talked about in the Wii episode, is kind of the back end of the weird little guys. Once we get to the PS3, it's all the prestige stuff, right? But here, they were still making weird little guys in a way that I really loved. They're still out there now, but it's what we've talked about, the heyday of anything goes.
Of the breakfast cereal design.
Right.
I actually think most people's experience of the PS2 era would probably be devoid of those mascot characters because if you think about what sells in gaming and always has, it's your sports games, it's your shooter games, it's your annual releases that become serialized in a mass marketing budget carries their popularity way. I remember back in the PS2 era, most of my friends having a copy of one of the recent NFL or NCAA games, a Madden or whatever, but maybe not having a Sly Cooper. And that being a distinctive difference where my gaming taste was always a little more cartoon character story driven. And most of the games that people I know would have been playing were a little more, even a GTA, I think counts as this sort of thing where Grand Theft Auto was a household title and Sly Cooper was not.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you bring up GTA because I think GTA 3 is a pivot point for not only video games, but video games as pop culture so I loved Grand Theft Auto 3. I played Vice City and San Andreas, and my love of the franchise wavered as I played them. And now I haven't played any of the modern ones. But there was something about Grand Theft Auto 3. Yes, we were all immature teens. We joked about beating up the hookers, which is dumb now, and but
it was dumb then.
Yes, it was dumb then.
Agreed. I just realized I'm younger than you. So Grand Theft Auto, I remember that was a very early exposure. I think I played it when I was 8 or 9 years old, which most adults or parents would be horrified by, but I think I turned out okay.
Yeah.
That being said, I remember obtaining somehow a secondhand Grand Theft Auto copy, but there was no gaming case because we were being discreet about how we were storing this game, this disc. And so I would imagine neither of you had the experience of being young enough to need to hide a Grand Theft Auto game from your parents. No. But the PS2 era, absolutely.
I'm reminded of stories of hiding the devil records, the heavy metal records and something else, one of those sleeves. Yeah, no, if I was doing that, it would have been with an NES game and labels on there. You can't hide that. I love this.
Well, there was a moment where I think I turned, let's say, 12. I don't know what age exactly, but it was one of the first birthdays where I had enough money to go buy my own game from GameStop. And I had recently played Grand Theft Auto 3 at someone's house, and I was in love with it. Like, I was left alone while the parents went outside and, like, did adult things.
Right.
And I played this for 4 hours uninterrupted, fell in love with the game, needed to buy it, saved my birthday money. My mom's boyfriend took me to GameStop and approved me to get this game. I took it home. I played it uninterrupted for, weeks, months, whatever. At some point, my dad discovered that I had a copy of this game, came to my house, demanded that I give it to him, and I never got it back. Never learned what happened.
He just wanted it for himself.
He never gave me his money. Exactly. Like, it's like almost the reverse of like the dog went to the farm up north, but with my Grand Theft Auto game. And I'm like, Dad, I know you're scolding me right now, but you're secretly going over there, picking up a sex worker on the corner of the street and doing degenerate activities. And like, come on.
Now, kids, if you're going to go and pick up sex workers and engage in violence, I'm glad you're doing it in the game.
Respect them.
Where I can see you at
safe.
home. I'd prefer you do it at home. Really, that's the evolution of the attitude we ought to be having.
Right, exactly. Absolutely.
Maybe I'm biased. I'm definitely biased.
But yeah, I mean, that franchise, that trilogy specifically, I have such fond memories of. Also, I'm always been a big music nerd and composition, and we talk about it a lot. But there's something about the Grand Theft Auto franchise and pop culture music and pop music. Like, I think about Vice City soundtrack all the time. Like, I just love driving around listening to the radio. It's so dumb, but like, I really did. And like, it's a thing that I don't really think about in games, not since Final Fantasy 15, when I went back to that earlier this year, and like, you could listen to all the Final Fantasy songs while driving around. It was like, it really took me back to GTA. But like, there was something satisfying about the storytelling. Like, this was early cinematic storytelling in games for this kind of generation where things looked realistic, we thought, for the time at least. And like, it's just kind of really interesting to me that, we could talk about AAA, cinematic games till the cows come home now in modern gaming. But back then, it was still pretty new, telling these kind of gritty, realistic stories. And like, it was Rockstar's bread and butter back then, for sure.
Yeah. No, it definitely moved forward that sort of edgy narrative that the PS1 gave us, and was a big realization of that promise. GTA for me is such a funny thing because I played the original Grand Theft Auto on the PS1 at my cousin's house. And if you've never played the original Grand Theft Auto, it is top down. You can get away with doing these levels of ultra violence because those old stick figure Flash cartoons of beating each other up are about as violent as far as the depiction goes. But I also grew up in northern New Jersey during the time when The Sopranos was on TV. And so there was a certain, and I grew up in and amongst the towns where they filmed. And so being not Italian was its own just sort of like, I got to deal with other kids, amongst all of the other things about me that got me bullied. So when GTA 3 came out, if you take away its trappings and just go, oh, it's a free-form, open-world, mission-based game, yes, give me that. Give me that. My household loves that shit. One way or another, in a certain amount of, like, certain crime family tropes and things like that, I'm like, this is just going to feel like work to get into this. I will go back and play it. I admire and admit and love. But to the point of what you were saying, Matt, I loved the soundtrack, and we had the 5 CD. Each disc was a different radio DJ soundtrack. It was incredible. This incredible thing. I don't know where my father got it. He brought it home one day, and it had the DJs as interstitials. As a music nerd,
amazing.
As a voice actor, as somebody who did college radio, everything like that, this was my everything.
That's so incredibly cool. I've never actually heard that there was a separate like series of radio station CDs released, and the fact that you put in the DJ interstitial makes that even cooler. Yeah. I think of something more recent like a Spotify DJ function where like I don't personally use that, but I know some people think that that's really fun and like curatory, but also like gaming soundtracks kind of rest on their laurels these days.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't mean to suggest that the music is like less interesting, but rather the way that it's released and showcased and packaged and marketed. The most interesting music project I can point to recently in gaming that I'm aware of is Austin Wintory with Stray Gods.
Yes.
The role-playing musical. Like there's like separate pathways You can get different albums that are based on the choices you would be making if you took this kind of path versus that kind of path in the game. I haven't bought the albums. I haven't even finished the game, to be honest, despite pre-ordering it and kickstarting it and all that fun stuff. But I think that that's amazing that exists, and that gets me really excited.
I just double-checked it. It was from Vice City, so it's even better, and it's 7 discs.
7 discs! Like I wonder how much that goes on like eBay now. Like, I bet that's something that you just probably can't find, because the versions of that still exist must be preserved. But I imagine, again, there's probably some like internet playlists that have recreated it, or like,
Goodness, I hope so,
preserved.
Because I'm not spending $228 on eBay, according to this link I just found on my phone.
Well, let's do the math. For 7 discs, no, let's not.
That's less than 40 a disc.
I guess in this economy, things could be worse. The thing that I wanted to tack on here is the maturity thing, the seriousness and the grittiness and all that, kind of like the PS2 being like an entry point of like evolving gaming into a more like this can be Sopranos level discussion. I also want to point out the weird fumbling middle steps of the PS2 that existed, where you have like your evolution of Jak and Daxter to Jak 2, where it sounds like, Matt, you might not be 100% as familiar with the Jak thing, but Geoff, you look like you know exactly what I'm talking about. It goes super edgy, and then like Jak starts talking with this, "I'm gonna kill Praxis," like this voice that he uses, and like it curses once or twice. In the same way that some late 90s, early 2000s media can just be cringeworthy by its edginess, the PS2 was right in the heart of that. Yeah. And so as it worked its way into games can be taken seriously, like in an adult manner, it also has a lot of examples of like attempting edginess and attempting maturity in ways that I find endearing now. But if they happened now, I think would probably turn me off.
Yeah. It would need to be made with a certain amount of self-awareness. I think a funny offshoot of that, something that I realized a little while ago, and I think it was when I was playing through the Final Fantasy X 10-2 remake with my spouse, where in the cinematics, they were grinding on wires on their shoes, and I realized that the PlayStation 2, again, sort of an heir to the extreme sports kind of thing. You know what? The PlayStation 2 had so much grinding. Whether you were leveling up your items in Disgaea Hour of Darkness, or you were just a cool skater kid on rails, wires, city rooftops, whatever. There was a lot of grinding on the PlayStation 2.
Yeah. I think it's funny also to tack on to Flora's like talk about how there were missteps. It's like one of the more famous ones. I mentioned Devil May Cry and how much I love that franchise.
Right.
But it stepped from like from 1 to 2. Dante, like, to be edgy, didn't talk as much. The snark was gone. The gore was upturned. And like it was just very bizarre when the first game's success was his snark and his ridiculous one-liners, and then they hard pivot back at the end of that console's life cycle with the third game, which was a prequel, which is one of the best in the series. And like they'll make that same mistake again in the Xbox 360 generation when they try to spin it off as a reboot. And like it's just so funny to me where other games, like to talk about RPGs for a bit, Geoff hinted at, like 10 and 10-2 did their own thing and didn't care. The Kingdom Hearts franchise also. I think about Kingdom Hearts 2 a lot because that opening, a lot of people like to complain that the opening is so long in the tooth if you're really not into the narrative, because it's mostly narrative, right? And out of left field because it's so different from how the first game starts.
Why are you playing Kingdom Hearts if you're not in for the narrative?
Right. And like for me, what's really brilliant about Kingdom Hearts 2 is they took a risk. You start the game as a character that was nowhere in the first game. It's a very Metal Gear Solid thing to do. And like, it's just interesting to me that I feel like while some of the edgy stuff took risks and failed, some of the RPGs and other franchise stuff took risks in a different way that were a success. I also have another like gaming sin to admit here. Some of the biggest flagship titles on this console I didn't play until the recent last few years on other consoles. I'm talking about games like Okami, Resident Evil 4, Shadows of the Colossus. I played all of them on modern hardware, and they're incredible. And to think now, like, I would say that Okami, those three in particular, stand the test of time.
Absolutely.
And are still fun to play now. In fact, I'm playing the Resident Evil 4 remake now, and I'm really enjoying that Leon is still a butthead and absolutely a Labrador. But like, that said, all of these games stand on their own in a way that is kind of incredible. Even though they're remakes or HD ports, they are only upturning a thing that was already there. They're not recreating it, you know?
So, Matt, I'm curious, when you revisited A Shadow of the Colossus, did you play the original version, like the PS2 version, or did you do the PS3, PS4, like remake even?
I did the
et cetera?
remake because it was
Okay.
just
Cool.
accessible to me.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating about Shadows of the Colossus, playing that only, I think I played it, it might have been either during the pandemic or pre-pandemic. I can't quite remember. But like, I was streaming more frequently. And so there were some games that I would stream the whole game, and that was one of them. And I remember people coming into chat, friends of mine who love that game, just to see me experience it. And I think the PS2 had a lot of games like that that we have now as well, but I think they go in different directions. I mean, just thinking about Team Ico, Ico and Shadow of the Colossus are games unlike anything else. And though I have not played The Last Guardian, I have heard that their more recent games just don't capture the imagination the way those two debut titles did as well.
I think it's great that the remakes and the remasters are happening so that people have that access. And Matt, I kind of want to break the idea of it, that being a gaming sin. We get to the games
Yeah.
when we get to them. The remakes and the remasters happen because people don't always get access to them. All of us were different ages when the PlayStation 2 came out, but whether it's that console or another one, if it's your first console when you're a kid, you don't have the pocket money to get every game you want. I'm an adult with disposable income. I can't get every game I want. And it still hurts.
fair.
But also, let's bear in mind, the PlayStation 2, facts figures for a moment, had 4,376 titles released worldwide during its life. Official titles from its debut in March of 2000 until its final game released in November 8th, 2013. Pro Evolution Soccer 2014. Sports games are everywhere. We just don't talk about them. And you add in the 7,918 PS1 titles released, giving you an effective library of 12,294 officially released games. If anyone has played all of them, fantastic. Can I wave at you from a window somewhere else?
I've only played 11,000 of those, so I know
Right.
I've also probably committed a gaming sin here, you know. Like,
Of course, yes. I mean,
sometimes you got to let a couple slip through.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's funny because also at the time when I think we're getting a console or playing a game or trying to play every game on those consoles or at least play the games we like, it seems like such a smaller world than it actually is. I think the reality is that no one plays every game for any console, no matter what console it is.
Right.
Just like it would be impossible for us to cover every game on the console. But I think the tentpole stuff for the PS2 are really fascinating because I feel like they set gaming trends in a way that some stuff now is doing that too, and we'll see what that looks like in 20 years, like you joked about earlier, Flora. But like, I'm reminded of, like, for sure, we hinted at it before, but the dance pads and the plastic instruments of it all. The first Guitar Hero came out in 2005 in North America. And I remember it was after the Slim had come out, more people had the PS2 than ever, and there was something about this game that just felt unlike anything that have ever existed. This was back when Harmonix was working with Red Octane to put out these games before they split off. And I worked in a game store at the time. The Guitar Hero controllers were everywhere. There were third-party controllers within months. Like, it's just one of those things that, like, everyone had them. I couldn't even compare this to anything else. I guess DDR is the closest, which was popular beforehand. But, like, there was something wholly unique about this game because I feel like the PS2 generation was the first time, before even we got the Wii, that people were buying video game consoles to play as a family in a way that, like, existed with the Nintendo and Super Nintendo, but it was very different. It became pop culture iconic in this generation that only continued. And I think Guitar Hero was a huge part of that.
I think with Guitar Hero, it goes beyond, or maybe not beyond, but like maybe parallel with the family console phenomenon, where I experienced the Guitar Hero phenomenon through friendships, like friend circles, parties, like going to friends' houses, bringing my own controller or having them have two. That was sort of the era for me where we would set up together. Like, this was like the beginning of LAN parties. This was the beginning of like split screen in my life. I remember split screen existing prior, but Guitar Hero was like, everyone knows this song. And so even the parents are going to like stand behind the couch and like sing along with you while you play with your friends.
And people will air guitar it and everything.
Absolutely. And I grew up playing music. I'm a guitarist, a musician in general. And so this was a major source of camaraderie for me in terms of just being able to like get people excited about music as a concept. Like this is something accessible that you can pick up and do, because the Guitar Hero controller, though it only has 5 fret buttons, you know, your Rock Band one later that would evolve from this would continue to complexify that. But the simplicity of Guitar Hero was just, can you hit these notes in time, and can you put your fingers in the right order at the right moment? And to people who were unfamiliar with music, it was a really understandable thing that I could put in their hands and have them just be able to do. They would do it poorly, sure. But like, I remember neighbors that I wouldn't even really know very well. Like, I'd barely know their first name, come over and hang out, and like they would sit on my couch while we played Guitar Hero together, and we just pass the controller back and forth and see if we can get a higher percentage on something. That era of just the physicality of gaming, I agree with you, Matt. I think that like the Wii captures this more with like the family element and like your Wii Sports and your whatever. But Guitar Hero was the sort of incipient point of when gaming like broke out of you are some sort of social reject and live in your mother's basement or go to an arcade with your friends and still should be ashamed of yourself, into like, no, this is cool. This is what we desire to do when we get together each holiday or whatever.
Yeah, and I will argue that as a fellow musician, that getting the hold the button, hit the strum bar at the right time, there is still a component of musicality there. I'm not going to say that you are a great musician because you got a perfect score, that South Park episode, et cetera, et cetera. But the PS2 was so good for so many music games. The idea of the PS1, again, this is one of those evolution pieces where there were many music games that were kind of in their starting stages in the PS1. You had Parappa the Rapper and Jammer Lammy. If you haven't played Parappa the Rapper 2, you don't have to. It's free on PlayStation Plus right now. You still don't have to. But other musical concepts were reaching such a cool point with licensed tracks. And before there was Rock Band, there was Amplitude and Frequency. There was Dance Dance Revolution, where I know that was on PS1. But really, all of the Dance Dance Revolution titles I have at home, and the 2 dance pads that I still have behind my couch, those are all PlayStation 2. The PS1, it was kind of a weird import time, and there was a collection thing. But PS2, you get DDR Max, you get DDR Extreme. You were along with the arcade releases.
I have a really strange anecdote about DDR, if you don't mind me indulging for a second.
Please.
There was a time where my hot water heater like started leaking in my childhood home, and therefore this was a carpeted hallway. We had to leave the house and get it like stripped out and the floors replaced and all this wonderful stuff. The day that we left this house, I was in the living room downstairs because my mom needed me to be like aware and around and like occasionally like change towels and all that good stuff. And I decided it would be a good idea to hook up the DDR dance pad to SSX3, the snowboarding game. And for some reason, this was probably about a year, maybe 2 years after my first snowboarding trip. So I think that's where the inspiration was coming from.
Oh, yeah.
I just snowboarded in real life. Surely I can take a DDR pad and snowboard in this game. And I spent so much time, like probably like 5 hours that day, trying to teach myself to snowboard on a DDR pad. And I actually figured it out. Like it's not as awkward as you would hope, because there's these like dead zones in the DDR pad that you can step on, and like you can just emphasize when you need to steer or turn your snowboard. You couldn't do tricks or anything, don't get me wrong, but like I could make it through the finish line. And I will always remember that for some reason. Just this weird like house is in disrepair, I'm playing video games and it doesn't make sense. And those two things going parallel in my memory, like I will just probably be 85 years old and still thinking about that.
It's tricky.
DDR pad, I have it. It's in its little original box. It's just, I don't know what I would ever do with it again. It's just, I can't get rid of it because it brings back those times.
I mean, we still, for speed runs, Twitch streaming, whatever else, people do challenge runs with all kinds of weird inputs and controllers, and people have crafted some of the strangest ones. And I've seen, you beat Dark Souls with DK bongos and stuff like that. But I feel like the DDR pad is kind of the great, in much the same way that Guitar Hero is a cool like intro to live your rock star dreams, get star power, feel the guitar. You use your feet up, down, left, right, X and circle, maybe more if you got a fancy one. And you can play your way through a lot of games, and people are still beating Celeste with dance pads and what have you. And I was so fortunate not that long ago to get a USB to PS2 converter. So yeah, I am plugging in more and more PlayStation peripherals into my PC right now to just have what can I do with this? And most of them are still in good enough condition that it's working out for me. I have a wireless Guitar Hero controller that made its way into my life not that long ago, so I finally downloaded Clone Hero. And I can, and from across the room, I can be a rock star. It's very fun. And you know what? We've been talking about how some experiences, some graphics, some gameplay conventions absolutely were the pinnacle at the time, but did not age great. But it was so known and accessible that we've got those great nostalgia. It's a nice coming together of that. Playing the Guitar Hero controller, we got fatigued, but it hasn't gotten old.
No. And I think it's like one of those things that kind of leads into why I think also the PS2 is a strong console. It's one of the most diverse libraries I think we've had in a very long time. I think that there's plenty of diversity now, especially with the indie scene, but like I think about all the games I played on a PS2 versus other consoles now. Like I've gotten more diverse as I've gotten older, and I've gone back to horror games and fighting games over the past year, first-person shooters. But at the time of owning a PS2, I needed to have all different kinds of games and genre stuff that I don't know that I would have had before. I mean, I played fighting games, I played sports games, I played music games, I played shooting games. Like I have that kind of diversity again now, but I don't think I've had it in the intervening years. And it was something about the availability, wrestling games, like because this was like the height of gaming as culture that then continued to evolve. This was the first time I really think that it was gaming as pop culture. And the PS2 was a big driver for that. And I think the diversity of games that we got, like I think about the games that I owned Soul Calibur 2, I owned Dragon Ball Z Budokai, all of them. I owned every WWE game that came out at the time. And then I still bought Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy 12. Like I can't think of another time until now in my gaming history that was that, maybe the Xbox 360 era, which is kind of around the same time. But I just think this was, you know, you talk about how many games came out for this console. You could kind of do anything in this era because it was a new injection of lifeblood into the video game market because there was so much more competition. Because there was so much more competition, it also meant that there were so many more different kinds of games that you could play.
It was sort of the kind of spike that was felt in Japan in the 80s when the Famicom came out and the Sega Master System and a number of other consoles all kind of building onto each other, and companies going, well, let's start a video game company. We can make some money with a video game. And we got a lot of that. We got that many titles. And honestly, more than any other console that I can think of, I would say the PlayStation 2 has forgotten more iconic games than some consoles get in their entire life cycle. How often do people talk about Maximo, the Ghosts and Goblins evolution?
Yeah,
it's not
true.
necessarily worthy of being in the annals of history, but it should not be forgotten. And it really wasn't that bad. It was pretty fun, and it was great at the time. And there's so many other games. And so, yeah, you could go down an entire rabbit hole. You could play nothing but racing games, have diversity of experience, and not even see NBA The Street Volume 2, which is considered one of the best sports games, period, one of the best PlayStation 2 games, period. And again, I'm only mentioning it because I'm just getting it on the list here.
I would love to throw NFL Street on there too. Like
Yeah.
I am resentfully like in no way a sports person at this point in my life.
But
but
that's
the
always good.
street games, like the EA Sports big games, were so over the top in a way that I still feel nostalgia for. It's different than your like backyard sports games. Like you have your standard mainline Maddens and your NCAAs and your whatever. You have your like kind of cartoony child-oriented ones, but like the big ones felt like they were oriented at this. Again, the PS2 is just doing this over and over, like this like edgy sort of crowd, because like you're doing like a jump, twirl, alley-oop, triple flip before you dunk the ball in the net. Like, okay, great. That's not realistic, but that's great. Like, good job, Tony Hawk. Also, I don't know if this was brought up, but there's so many games that are just cash grab games in this generation that I kind of love. Like, you have your movie adaptation games like your Spider-Mans or your Lord of the Rings, And they're not very good video games. Like, I can't praise them very much.
Some of them aren't very bad.
Right. Like, they're playable. They work. I can get to the credits when I hit start on them, which is more than I can say for some modern releases. Anyway, I also would point out, like, some of the bad cash grabs that I still sort of love. Like, I just recently bought, because I saw High School Musical for the first time. I hate to admit this on a podcast. Yeah. I know. For many reasons, I just brought this into my life. I found a PS2 game. And it's High School Musical 3, like the game, the musical, whatever. And it's just a bunch of like rhythm action stuff. It's basically like all of the Yakuza mini games put into a game without the story, without the combat. It's just like, let's play baseball, let's dance, let's sing a song, let's whatever. And I'm like, that would never get made today. And I love that about the PS2 era so much. Like, as cynical as the economy and the developing process probably was around that, you don't really get those, like, we're going to pretend to be authentic and yet know nothing about the game and say it's totally related to this game sort of like marketing spinoffs.
And the graphics got just good enough that you can't just explain it away with bad graphics why the models don't look anything like the actors. But that's its own charm on top of it.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking in our previous episode about a retrospective on Spider-Man and video games. Spider-Man 2 for the PS2, for some people, is the defining game. And I know for a fact in Insomniac sites, like the traversal at least, that walked so Insomniac Spider-Man can run. And in the same way, like the Lord of the Rings games that you mentioned, especially Two Towers and The Return of the King, for franchise games, were pretty solid, especially if you liked Gauntlet and that kind of game. Like,
it was better than the Gauntlet one that they had for PS1, definitely.
Yeah. And I know Dave Jackson, by the time this episode comes out, I don't think it'll have aired yet, but is covering The Return of the King on his show, and like went back and played it. It was like he, in his Discord, was talking about how he was shocked that it was still good. Like, he wanted it to be, but wasn't sure. And I love that. I love that some of these games kind of defied that mediocreness because they were just good enough. And that was okay. Right. There are tons of games that I loved like that. I mean, I think Dragon Ball Z Budokai 1 is probably one of the defining fighting games. I don't know that if I went back now, if I'd still love it, right? But like, it for sure walked so Super Dragon Ball Z could run now, and like, or Dragon Ball Z Super, but like, it's fascinating. Like, once Akira Toriyama could animate in 3D, well, he wasn't animating, but his style was, it kind of blew the doors wide open, especially for the Dragon Quest games at the time too.
With Budokai, you just unlocked a memory that I didn't expect to even talk about on this show, but I'd love to go into it for a second. I, again, grew up with a single mother and didn't have money for cable, and so I never got to watch Dragon Ball Z. I knew my friends loved it at school. I remember drawing like Goku's in the margin from the little like here's how to draw anime books they would have. But I didn't have that firsthand experience, right? So there was a moment where my mom got me a copy of Budokai. And that was how I experienced Dragon Ball Z for the first time, was through Budokai. And that is like a definitive experience, I'm willing to say, because I did go back and try and watch the anime later, and I was like, no, Budokai's cooler. Like even though, like, it's not as impressive or anything like that. But that era like set the stage for games that are still being made today, like 100%. And like one of my issues with when animes become video games is that they are almost always interpreted through the lens of arena brawler. That's what they always want to be. And I don't actually think that's the best medium for a lot of games. Like every Naruto game is an arena brawler. Like your Kill la Kill adaptation is an arena brawler. But I think Kill la Kill makes a lot more sense because that's where the story takes place, is like in an actual arena in the academy where the story takes place. Right. Like Naruto, that doesn't really make sense because so much of what they're doing is exploring and like moving around the country. So I just really think that it's fascinating that you can point directly backwards to those games and say, this is where that era began. And like, this is still a definitive experience that when I buy like a Dragon Ball Fighter Z today, that's going to basically recreate shot for shot what Budokai did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and also, like, so I held up on camera 2 games, Fullmetal Alchemist 2, The Curse of the Crimson Elixir, and Lupin III, Treasure of the Sorcerer King. 2 anime games that I own from my original library that came out towards the end of the PlayStation 2's life cycle. But, like, we get tons of anime games now. There have been some really cool stuff that have come out in the years since, like especially for newer franchises like My Hero Academia, which I hear, even though I haven't watched a ton of, has some incredible video games. But Lupin the Third is an anime that I've loved for a long time. Some of it has aged well, some of it hasn't, but all in all, I really like the spy thriller kind of thief with a heart of gold kind of narrative. When this game came out, I didn't know anybody else who watched the anime, and yet I was able to buy this game that was kind of third person, investigative. You got to play as all the different characters. It wasn't great, but I was so happy to have one. And both Full Alchemist games on the PS2 were solid games that also weren't brawlers. They were kind of action adventure games. And it was really interesting to me that these very heavily narrative shows got really heavily narrative games that sort of spun off from the main anime, sometimes incorporated the main story. And like, I love that we had that kind of experimentation with franchises that crossed over to video games in the PS2 that really don't happen as much now. Like, since the Xbox 360 era has been less and less, unless there's a lot of money behind it to spin it off into its original and own thing, like the forthcoming Wolverine game, the Spider-Man games, things like that. And it's just really fascinating how that has kind of shifted over the years.
Yeah, we've mentioned a few times, and the point hasn't faded, that the PlayStation 2 was a definite watermark of, wow, beep boop, gaming's cool now, sort of gaming headline of things. But it's interesting to think of it also through the lens of anime, because I think that 2000 to 2005 was when anime was around. Anime was happening. There was some Toonami going on. There's a little bit of Adult Swim. There's a little bit of everything else. I would think about this in terms of how, at this point, you weren't relying on fan subs as much. You could still download them off of file sharing sites. But I think of it in terms of just about any store that sold DVDs, videos, anything like that, also had a distinct anime section of some kind. You were still buying just 6 episodes of Cowboy Bebop for $30 on one disc at a time. But it was there, and it was coming in, and it had some legitimacy. And so you can kind of even see that reflected in these ideas where, well, let's just get those series over. And sometimes it's, yeah, let's just make it a big old fighting game. And other times, let's make it a narrative. And it was allowing games that would have been too weird a generation before to make their way over. One game that kind of touches on a number of subjects we've gone over on this unsurprisingly long retrospective, Guitaru Man.
Yeah,
which
there it is.
Was a very anime as fuck kind of music game that was, you were a loser 12-year-old, 15-year-old, I don't know, they've all got very big heads, character whose dog can talk and is apparently a robot dog, and you're apparently an alien who is the heir to an intergalactic instrument/weapon/artifact called the Guitaru, which is basically what everybody wants a keytar to actually be, but it's actually more of a guitar. And you face off against intergalactic threats that want the Guitaru in music battles, and you go to your home planet and fight the evil Zoe, who isn't at all an anime David Bowie based off of your rival in school, and do all kinds of music battles there. And every stage song is a different genre, and it goes in all sorts of wild directions, and the sound bites to it are choice and insane. This is an unhinged music game. It is one of my favorite games of all time. The studio behind it went on to make Elite Beat Agents and several other music titles. And in fact, when Elite Beat Agents was first just Osu Tatake Uendan on the DS, and there was no import or adaptation going on, I learned about this in terms of, the guys who made Guitaru Man are making more games? Kind of thing. This game I played once. I read about it. I played it at someone's apartment when I was in college. It was like a fever dream. And every time I play the game, that feeling is still there. To get it complete in box is over $200 now. They made a PSP adaptation, which doesn't make it easier. I don't remember if they made any sort of digital remake of it, but the soundtrack's incredible. Listeners, anybody, if you have not experienced this game in any way, shape, or form, look it up. It's wild. It's nuts. And on the other side of things, as far as a game where it's music-ish, but also a different kind of cool and a different kind of transitioning over. You get games like Rez, which is essentially a shoot 'em up as seen through European dance clubs, dance music, I suppose. And that has gotten some remakes and that has gotten some re-exploration. And Rez Infinite is an excellent game and an excellent package. And even if it's not one's cup of tea, I feel it's worth just even watching a video of it, checking out the first stage of it, because there again, it was another. I think the real crux on this is all of these sorts of titles that we've been talking about, all these wild, cool ideas, they do still happen, but they're indie titles, or they don't get a physical release. When I was looking up how many games the PlayStation 2 can effectively play, and does that give the PlayStation 2 the largest library? Statistically, I think the Nintendo Switch at this point has the largest library because of digital distribution and some of the backwards compatibility that employs. But all of these were physical games that could be found. And I think a great takeaway to be taken from this is these are games that are influencing the indie developers of today. If the PlayStation 2 is your first console, you are of a professional level now where you're going to be making these games, and it's good to know the names so that you can know the influence.
I think of games like I think it's called Spin Rhythm XD.
Yes.
It's an indie game that's like a DJ simulator, and it, I believe, does have hardware you can get for this game, but is built around not having hardware.
Yes.
And so you can keyboard and mouse your way through it or controller your way through it. But it like evokes the parallel peripheralism of the PS2 era without actually having the mass marketing production budget underneath it. And I wonder to what extent the industry, quote unquote, like learned its lesson about peripherals in this era, because they don't really happen now. You have your Nintendos of the world, who I really think are like the one last sort of holdout there.
They're toy makers.
Right. That's what video games were still living in this dual camp between, is toys. Like your Guitar Hero was a toy. Like I break out my Explorer, and though it looks like a guitar, it's a toy. I don't think that makes it less of an instrument. I don't think that makes it less able for me to enjoy as an adult. But like, there's no equivalent of that now. Like I've got my Nintendo Labos, I've got my, I guess Skylanders is the last thing I can really think of, or like Amiibo like functions in the Switch. But again, it's all like specifically, those are like little action figures. Those are like toys, capital T toys. And I wonder like what would ever, if anything, bring that era of peripheral hardware back to gaming. I don't really think that's going to happen.
I'm not sure. Well, and something to think on with that as a food for thought for everybody here on this podcast and listening to it. The really interesting thing with Spin Rhythm XD is it doesn't have specific DJ hardware. It is made to be interfaced with existing DJ hardware. People bringing in their own stuff. They can bring in their own turntables and work with it. I was like, oh, so I can finally bust out some DJ Hero controllers? No, people are figuring out how to hack that. You actually need the professional level stuff, which is incredible to me.
That's an important distinction. Yeah.
And it's a very funny one. I've made this rediscovery at least 3 different times. But you're right. The idea of unique controller experiences, unique peripheral, tactile experiences of how we play our games. And again, as we go into the world of more and more digital releases with fewer and fewer physical releases, or those become the prestige release, the collector's edition, or anything like that, what are other ways that there is a tactile connection to the games? And it might even be, figuring out a way to, how many of you still got those plastic guitars lying around? Great, we made an old school shoot 'em up that you can actually control using the Guitar Hero controller, or something like that, or some new thing. I don't know if they're going to be making new controllers, but there's enough out there. SingStar was such a popular karaoke game in Europe and a number of other places. They made so many releases. People probably still have microphones. It's almost building on the shoulders and shells of what came before, and enough things were thrown at the wall on the PlayStation 2 in particular that there are a lot of shoulders and shells.
Yeah, I think this console, more than what we've covered so far, is the hardest to cover every game that everyone's played. I mean, we've talked about a fraction of them, and we could go another hour and a half and cover the rest, but I feel like even still, we wouldn't.
Does anybody else have a list of games that they wanted to get to that just wants to rattle them off?
I mean, for me, like some of the stuff we haven't even talked about, we talked about some RPGs and some horror games, but like the Silent Hill games were king on this console.
Silent
The
Hill
Resident Evil
2.
games were kings on this console. You know, I did mention fighting games before. I forgot to mention when we were talking about fighting games briefly. Marvel vs. Capcom 2. This was the defining place to play that game. You really couldn't play it at home anywhere else. Geoff has my copy of this game that I had kept for many years because I didn't play it anymore. And so I donated it to the library of Geoff and Sarah. The Shin Megami Tensei games, Nocturne for one. Like it was
the Digital Devil Saga duology.
like Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne featuring Dante from Devil May Cry, which is a meme now.
And Knuckles.
And Knuckles. With funky mode is like that was my first experience with any of Atlus's games because my friend bought it because we liked demons because we were kids and we liked Devil May Cry. Like there's so many titles that came out for this console that I think it was my starting point for a ton of franchises that now have dominated a lot of my time with games.
I think if I have to bucket list one title that we haven't brought up at all, it would be Bully by Rockstar.
Yeah.
We talked about the GTA games, but Bully is like set in a school environment, like high school environment. It functions very GTA-like. I only played it for the first time on PC like 2 years ago, maybe 3. And I feel like that's such a strange question mark as far as like why Rockstar never did a sequel or a remake or whatever. And I've seen headline after headline of, oh, we're working on it. And then it gets canceled or repurposed or the staff gets like reallocated. I feel like we've talked about everything else at some point that I feel strongly attached to. But Bully is like a big, like, what happened? Why did we never get a PS3 Bully or a PS4 Bully or at this point a PS5 Bully? Like, that's got to be coming, right? And if not, what are we doing? The algorithm for what that game does checks so many boxes of what made the PS2 era work. Like, it was the first, like, open worldy sort of feel. No loading screens. You just run around, you hijack, like, stuff. You skateboard around town. Like, you get in fights. But you had, like, a schedule. You had, like, mini games. You had, like all of the little component parts that kind of aren't really designed into games anymore, with the exception of like your major AAA releases. Those are the sorts of things that I would really love to see like game design go back to. And actually, now that I think about that, I feel like another game that might want to be brought up is Star Wars Battlefront 2.
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm not a diehard Star Wars fan, but this was like an era of both AI programming, local co-op, and online co-op, where like there was like a trifecta of what this game could do to be entertaining, where if you did at all buy into the Star Wars aesthetic and mythos, then what you were doing is like living out a power fantasy.
Yep.
Yeah.
But you were also like able to play something that felt really well balanced and that felt fair when your friends were there or when they weren't. And I think the later Battlefront games lost sight of that a lot. I'm not going to harp on like the loot box stuff. Who cares? But like the actual design of the game, I think never was returned to. And I can't really point to like a great example of 2023 co-op multiplayer games that like capture that spirit and capture that feeling. And I don't know if that's nostalgia talking, but I really think there was something specific going on there that isn't most times.
If you're
Yeah, I
feeling
think
nostalgic
that-
for it, then so am I.
Yeah, and I think Battlefront 2 specifically, like there were Star Wars games before that, Star Wars games after that, but something about Battlefront 2, again, in this generation, popularized genre crossover in a way and franchise crossover that other games did not. There were Star Wars games based on the new movies. There were Star Wars games, that were arcadey, but there was something about Battlefront 2 specifically that then the new Battlefront tried to recapture and missed the mark. I like the new Battlefront. I don't think it's as good as that one. But there's something about that one specifically that I think really kind of defined what it was like to insert your franchise into a video game and did it well in the same way that, seeing Dragon Ball Z as a fighting game, seeing like all of these other things. I think now is a great time, before we go another hour or two, to talk about our favorite game. I feel like for me, this is going to be the hardest console to do it for. Something about the Nintendo consoles we've covered in the past, there are like those defining franchise titles. Whereas here, I'm as likely to pick a Spider-Man 2 as I am to pick, Final Fantasy 12. And I think none of those answers would be wrong. But Flora, why don't you start us off and tell us what your number one, like, this is my favorite game on this console?
Just to be that person, can I give you two?
You can give
Sure.
us honorable mentions by all means.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So it literally is tied for me.
Yeah. Awesome.
I will speak with equal brevity about both. My favorite game probably ever from that era is Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy.
Sure.
I don't know why, but part of it is it's one of the first games that I bought with my own money. It was one of the first games that I owned, and therefore that like has that sort of, you play it a ton when you're a kid. You don't really have the expendable income that we mentioned. But it also like it touches on these really like deep thematic elements that I would then recognize later in like sci-fi and fantasy literature and in film. And when my cultural senses were a little more developed, I would keep returning back to like, oh, that's why Dark Eco felt so like specific and so resonant with this theme of dark and evil and whatever else. And I started speedrunning this game later in my life. And so it added to the nostalgia that was there. I will say the other game for me is SSX Tricky.
Nice. Sure.
SSX Tricky is like a perfect video game. It plays on the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater Extreme Sports nostalgia of that era, like where like that was really the zenith of sports games, in my opinion. But SSX Tricky brought a style and a lack of realism and a sort of like punchiness, both aesthetically and musically, but also in terms of character design and like the little plot threads that were throughout and the rivalries that would happen between the characters. I can pick up that game today and still feel as tight with the mechanics as it felt when I picked it up in 2001. So I think those two games really capture the PS2 for me for totally different reasons.
I mean, that's a great answer, and both of them incredible games. It's funny. I think my number one choice has to be. So I'm also going to say two. One of them is really brief. Kingdom Hearts changed how I looked at RPGs. Final Fantasy VII did it the first time, and then Kingdom Hearts really kind of blew it up in a way that I didn't think possible, especially with crossover. I love media crossover. I'm a sucker for that kind of stuff. I know it's fan bait, but like seeing Squall in a not Final Fantasy game broke my brain, right? Seeing Sid, the Highwind Sid that I loved, that kind of stuff kind of blew me away. The first time I saw Cloud with Vincent's arm gauntlet and cape, I was like, what's the story here? And I love that game. But for me, I think my number one goes back to my fanboying as a voice actor nerd and like genre defining titles. And that's The Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, a franchise we haven't really talked about. Everyone knows I love our best friend, Yuri Lowenthal, who voiced the prince then.
Yep.
And they are working on a remake that he's talked about on the show that is in production in some level, that he was asked to return to play the prince, which is very exciting. But like, I liked platformers, played them my whole life, but there's something about the way you could move in a 3D space with the prince in this game, the rewinding time mechanic, which became ubiquitous with video games for so much longer after this. And then how the franchise kind of fell apart. Like, I love the second game, and then the third game wasn't as great. And then, like, the series has had its struggles, then spawned Assassin's Creed, and then has come back. But there's something about this title specifically that just felt like a really great hero's journey, a really fun title, and, like, that tight platforming that we praise Uncharted for and some other games, but I really feel started here. And Ubisoft said this themselves, but Prince of Persia Sands of Time walked so Assassin's Creed could run. And there's something about the running and climbing in this game that I've never felt again. Now, mind you, I haven't played it since it came out. I don't know if it's aged well, though I assume it does. But like, there's just something defining to that game in this generation that was on other consoles too. But for me, it was a PS2 game and really kind of broke my brain on how you could traverse games and why traversal to this day in a game is one of the paramount mechanics over other things, right? Because we've quoted Miyamoto many times, but like making good traversal and then building a game around it is a strong way to make a game that will be fun. Doesn't always work, but like this game specifically is like a core memory for that kind of engaging in video games.
It's been a little while since I played Prince of Persia, but I'll say Yuri's performance holds up, if nothing else.
For sure, 100%.
And I mean, honestly, I wasn't bringing up much with Prince of Persia and things because I wanted to, on this, certainly my own personal idea on this was sticking to the games that were really PlayStation 2 games. Because,
Sure.
Yes, I did say, the eventually default, and some things went back and forth. But yeah, if we brought in the multi-platform titles, we'd be here forever. We already are. But for me, I would say, I already pontificated and elucidated about Guitar Man. That's up there. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater and Subsistence it is a courtesy to Matt that I don't start talking about Metal Gear Solid, because the series is one of those where I will be Charlie Pepe Sylvia about that series, because it is the most ridiculous goddamn series, and I love it for that. It's everything. And so that's a truly honorable mention. That's up there. But I think for consistency, I think because of truth, my favorite PS2 game is Katamari Damacy.
Yeah.
It is truly a fantastic soundtrack. It is an incredible gameplay experience. One of the first games. I also, now that I've had, 3 hours to think about it since I first said it, one of the first games I had on the PS2 was Tekken Tag Tournament. But anyway, I got We Heart Katamari because I loved playing Katamari Damacy so much, and I would get a full gameplay experience of it at a friend's house. And when I eventually went back and played it myself, and then was able to import my constellations from that save file into We Heart Katamari. We Heart Katamari has incredible gameplay experiences, and I love it so much. If I could have that all as one thing, no question, greatest ever. But I think the original Katamari Damacy, for fulfillment of mission, for experience, for working with constraints and creating something incredible because of it, it is easily one of my favorite games on the PlayStation 2, one of my favorite games of all time. So how could I say anything else?
Before we start to wrap up and, pitch the Patreon and all that fun stuff, I would love at the top, when you are still paying attention, to give Flora the chance to talk about all the cool stuff she does. She's a writer, podcaster. Please take this moment to plug where folks can find you online, and of course, find the incredible work that you make.
Thank you. And I've really enjoyed this podcast experience, both like nostalgia tripping and also like just learning about things like Guitar Man that like I just somehow didn't ever know about, but now I have screenshotted the Wikipedia page and I'll be going to look at later. So
watching your face when I talked about it has been one of the best things of this whole week. Thank you.
Oh my God. Yeah, I have very transparent facial responses. So like clearly I was like, what? Holy crap. I'm going to play this exactly as soon as I'm done hanging out with them. But anyway, if you want to keep up with my work, I guess the best place to look is epiloguegaming.com. That's my website where I write about video games from like a storytelling perspective mostly, but also talk about like art and game design and like more critical cultural things and whatnot. Most recently, I just posted an article that was thematically designed around a boss fight that I will not talk about here for spoiler reasons. But in the most recent Spider-Man 2 game, the PS5 one, there is a boss fight. And I have titled the article Couples Therapy and Spider-Man 2. So if you are interested in that, that seems to be doing really well. And then we just posted like a holiday-related article for the Day of Thanks that we happened to be giving. Apart from that, the podcast that I partake in is Left Behind Game Club, and we just released a Final Fantasy 16 episode. And if you want to hear some critical thoughts on that game, I think that we had some nuance there. But like, if you want to hear something that isn't just, oh my God, graphics, go listen to that episode. And then I guess if you hate yourself like I do, go to Twitter or X or whatever and like find me at Ludonarrative FM. I do still share gaming stuff there. I just resent that platform. So
that's fair.
Marketing, SMH, etc.
Yada, yada.
The Final Fantasy 16 episode is very good. It also features previous guest of this show, Dave Jackson. And yeah, it was a nuanced conversation, although in my head, I'm just like head empty, Clive Pretty. But there is more to that conversation, and it was great. Though you did talk about that as well. Definitely go check out all that stuff. Flora has also done a side quest for us, which was really great. And I will constantly pester Flora to do more, which I'm excited for. So yeah, thank you for joining us. This was such a fun conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been delightful to be
Likewise.
Yeah, to be talking about this incredible console and our wonderful experiences. And listeners, we put it to you. What were your first experiences with the PlayStation 2? Was it your first console? Were you born after the PS2 came out? I will somehow make my peace with that, but I still would like to hear about it. Are you mad at us because we didn't talk about Dark Cloud, God Hand, the Shadow Heart series, any Onimusha, Sky Gunner, any of those titles, and so many more, because we can't name all of them. We shouldn't name all of them, but we do want to hear about them.
You did mention Mr. Mosquito offhandedly, so I want to at least give you some street cred. You at least covered that one diehard fan base that I'm a part of.
Fantastic. So. Yeah, that's the one where I look up the price of it online and the color leaves me as if I were bitten by said mosquito. But We want to hear about all of these titles, about all of your experiences, about how you were able to cajole it into your house or not, one way or the other. We want to hear about it, and there's so many great ways to get in touch with us. You can find us across all social media that we are a part of at Fun and Games Pod. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, what you thought of previous episodes, who you'd like us to speak with, and what you'd like us to speak about on future episodes. If you want to be a part of the vote for which consoles we do retrospectives on in the future, or get a good view of what it is we're working on, things we may be writing or doing outside of just this podcast, you can also check out our Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. You don't have to be a subscriber to see most of the things we put out, in fact, but that's a great way to get an all-in-one place to check it out. You don't have to pay money to even be a subscriber, but we are thankful for everybody who is on our audience list right now, no matter what tier they're on, but we do want to shout out those that are up on the high scoreboard today. And the high scoreboard is Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Roger Reichart, Alejandro Alves, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Robert Proyne, and Sean Bowen. Thank you so much for your continuing support. Please enter your initials on the high scoreboard. It'll have its own little animated GIF on the memory card, and we'll cry horrible tears if we bring up the delete menu.
I also want to shout out that by the time you're hearing this, the third poll will be closed, but we are doing Potent Portables edition. This was Geoff's brainchild. We did both each still pick 2, and currently in the running for the lead is the PSP and the Game Gear tied, and not a single vote for the Virtual Boy, which I kind of anticipated, though we will talk about eventually.
It's kind of like how I always want Waluigi to be in games, but I never want Waluigi to be in games. It makes sense.
It does make sense. But right now, those are deadlocked. I haven't figured out how we're going to do a tiebreaker. I know some folks do Smash Brothers bouts and other things. I'm trying to think of a creative competition way that we can use a video game to decide who wins. But we will do more of these polls. I'm not sure if we'll do another one before the end of the year, so probably more stuff in the new year, but it's been a fun way to kind of navigate all these consoles that Geoff and I are going to talk about inevitably, but now with your input as our loyal listeners, so thank you for that. Also, by the time this airs, I will have released my latest article. I am really excited to be writing more frequently. This one is how I've learned to love horror games, and will be probably one of the newer posts by the time you're listening to this, so definitely go check that out. It is called Matt's Musing, Confessions of a Coward, How I Learned to Love Horror Games. So more on that once it's published, but I'm looking forward to y'all reading that as well.
And also, if you'd like to be part of the conversation more immediately, you can also visit certainpov.com, where you can find links to not only other fantastic Certain POV podcasts, but a permanent invite link to our Discord server, where we continue conversations like this and other things that just happen to pop into our head, because it is a Discord server after all. Beyond that, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this podcast on, if it's one that allows for ratings and reviews, we welcome all those, particularly those on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Those are the best ways to get this podcast in front of new people, new audience members, and more people to be part of the conversation, because we really couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey there, Screen Beans. Have you heard about Screen Snark?
Rachel, this is an ad break. They aren't screen beans until they listen to the show.
Fine. Potential Screen Beans. You like movies and TV shows, right?
I mean, who doesn't? Screen Snark is a casual conversation about the movies and television shows that are shaping us as we live our everyday lives.
That's right, Matt. We have a chat with at least one incredible guest every episode, hailing from all walks. We've interviewed chefs,
Writers, costumers, musicians,
yoga teachers, comedians, burlesque dancers,
folks in the film and TV industry,
and more.
We'd be delighted for you to join us every other Monday on the Certain POV Podcast Network.
Or wherever you get your podcasts, fresh and tasty off the presses.
What? That's not...
Can I call them Screen Beans now?
Fine.
Screen Beans!
So tune in and we'll see you at the movies or on a couch somewhere.
'Cause you're all Screen Beans now.
She will be mine.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.